Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is our 120th deck and it's titled Otter Dominion. And if you haven't seen the show before, what we are doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com, working with a budget of $100 or less, and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So very quickly, before we get into the actual deck tech, I want to take a second to highlight some of our social media accounts, some of the ways that you can help support the channel, and of course highlight some people who are currently supporting the channel. So first up, you can find us over on Twitter at 13POYNZ, Reddit u/POYNZ13, email dungeonlearnersguide@gmail.com. If you ever have any questions, you can reach out to us over there. I'm also happy to take any suggestions for future cards, or if you just want to chat, do let me know. Otherwise, if you're looking to support the channel, other than, of course, just liking the video and subscribing to the channel, which does help out quite a bit, you can find us over on Patreon, patreon.com/dungeonlearnersguide, where you can join the 7 people listed below, and that is William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Calvin Schmidt, Eric Way, Jeff Winger, Jeffrey Boos, and Salty and Sunshine. So to the 7 of you all, thank you so much. And if you would like to join those 7 names and get access to things like the deck lists a week early, access to a Discord channel where we brew up a lot of the decks, and also the first place I look for people to play in the games. So if you've ever wanted to be on the channel, that is a great way to do it. You'll get access to the unedited gameplay videos, so you can hear the players talking and interacting with each other rather than just my narration over a shortened version of it. You'll also get a random card sent to you every single month as a thank you for all of your support. And finally, what I think is the most important, you'll also get access to the guarantee from me that any cards you suggest will be turned into decks for this channel. Eventually, at least. I do work pretty far in advance, but I will get to them at some point. I will, of course, do my best to get to everybody's suggestions, but I can't promise that for anyone who is not a patron. So please do send me suggestions, and I will do my best to get to them. But other than that, I think it's time we jump into our deck tech. So our first thing we got to do is talk about our random card of the week, which was suggested to us by Devin Purser over on Patreon, and that card is Lutri the Spellchaser. So Lutri the Spellchaser is 1 and a hybrid blue-red for a 3/2 elemental otter. It has companion, but we're not using it for its companion today. We are using it as our commander. And it has flash, so when Lutri the Spellchaser enters the battlefield, if you cast it, copy target instant or sorcery spell you control, you may choose new targets for the copy. So as I mentioned, this is going to be our commander for the week as well. And I know a lot of you are probably saying the same thing, but Zach, this commander and this card is actually banned in Commander, and you are 100% correct. This is not a legal commander. It's not a legal card that we can be playing in Commander, but I figured we're kind of rule zeroing this one. If people aren't okay with it, we do have Rutha in the deck as well to be used as a backup commander, so we do have a way to make the deck function. But we're going to see how Lutri works, and if people don't like it, then we just won't play it. But I don't think Lutri as a commander is necessarily a problem. I think that Lutri as a companion is a problem because any deck that runs blue and red could just play it for free. We're not doing that. We are putting it in the command zone, so it's technically not a free roll for us, but we're still going to see how it works. So that is our commander for this week, and of course we got to talk about some themes of the deck to see what we're actually trying to do. So our first major theme is going to be reducing the cost of our spells. We want to make sure that when we cast our spells and then we can cast Lutri and we can copy those spells, we need to have the mana available to do that all in one turn. So we're going to use cards like Goblin Electromancer, which is a blue and a red for a 2/2 Goblin Wizard that simply says instant and sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. Because if we can make our instants and sorceries really cheap, it's going to be very easy to copy them with Lutri. And if we're already copying them with Lutri, we may also want some rituals that we can cast. Because if we can copy things with Lutri, which, for example, costs 1 and possibly red, we can use something like Pyretic Ritual, which is 1 and a red for an instant that makes 3 red mana. And if we can copy it with Lutri, we are doubling up on that mana production. And if we have something like Goblin Electromancer, Pyretic Ritual only costs 1 red mana instead of 2 mana, so making this a lot easier to cast, a lot easier to copy, and now all of a sudden, we're casting a lot of spells because they're a lot cheaper, and we're making the mana to cast more and more spells. So what do we do with all of those spells? Well, the short answer is we copy them, because we need to do this as many times as possible. So we have something like Teach by Example, which is a blue, red for an instant. When you cast your next instant or sorcery spell this turn, copy that spell. You may choose new targets for the copy. So what you can kind of see happening here is we want to cast a ton of instants and sorceries. We want to make sure they are nice and cheap. We want to make a ton of mana, and we want to copy them as much as possible. But that doesn't win us the game, you might notice. We're not talking about any cards that specifically win the game, and we will get to that in just a moment, but of course we got to talk about some of our key cards first. Some ways that are going to help push us to our win condition, which, little bit of a spoiler, is going to be our third key card that we're going to talk about, so we'll get there, I promise. But our first key card we got to talk about is Thousand Year Storm. What is the best way to copy spells in the Izzet colors? It's probably Thousand Year Storm, because it's 4 blue, red for an enchantment. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, copy it for each other instant and sorcery spell you've cast before at this turn. You may choose new targets for the copies. So if we cast something like Pyretic Ritual to make 3 red mana, and then we copy it, we actually copy the copy spell, and then we can copy the Pyretic Ritual some more, and it just kind of gets out of hand very, very quickly. So Thousand Year Storm is perfect for what we want to be doing, and it's the main way we're going to make a ton of copies of a single spell. Our second key card is going to be Storm King's Thunder. Very similar to Thousand Year Storm, but in this case, it's X red for an instant that says when you cast your next instant or sorcery spell this turn, copy that spell X times. You may choose new targets for the copies. So as long as we've made a ton of mana, we can use Storm King's Thunder to cast whatever our next spell is and copy it a bunch of different times. But again, none of these are win conditions. We haven't talked about a single card that actually wins us the game. So what are we trying to copy in this deck? And I'm going to be perfectly honest, there's only one win condition in the entire deck, unless we want to beat people down with Lutri and Goblin Electromancers, which you probably don't want to do, and that is Eternal Dominion. And Eternal Dominion is 7 blue, so a massive 10 mana for a sorcery that says search target opponent's library for an artifact, creature, enchantment, or land card, put that card into play under your control, then that player shuffles their library, and it also has Epic. And Epic means that for the rest of the game, we are not allowed to play any more spells, but at the beginning of our upkeep, we copy the spell except for its Epic ability, and you may choose a new target for the copy. This looks a little bit weird, because why would we care about copying a ton of spells if we're just going to cast one spell a turn for the rest of the game? The short answer is, if we can copy Eternal Dominion, we actually get an epic trigger for every single copy that resolves, because we're no longer casting spells. We are using the copies to then resolve and trigger Eternal Dominion. So if we get up to, say, 5 copies of Eternal Dominion, then at the beginning of our upkeep, we get 5 different copies of Eternal Dominion every single turn. That means we're searching our opponent's libraries for 5 cards every single turn. We can get their best artifacts, best creatures, best enchantments, or maybe even their best lands. Maybe we can mana fix a little bit to activate abilities that we can't normally pay for. So Eternal Dominion is going to be the win condition in the deck, and I actually went out of my way to make sure that there were no other win conditions as far as I'm aware, other than beating down with little mana dork creatures, which, again, you probably don't want to do. So if we can copy Eternal Dominion as many times as possible, we should be able to win the game pretty handily over the course of the next few turns. But those are all of our key cards, and the next thing we got to do is talk about some cool interactions, some cards that synergize very well together and push us toward our victory, even if they don't necessarily cause a victory on their own. So the first of our cool interactions is going to be between Reiterate and Mind Splice Apparatus. So Reiterate is 1 red for an instant with buyback for 3. Copy target instant or sorcery spell. You may choose new targets for the copy. And we're going to partner that up with Mind Splice Apparatus, which is 3 and a blue for an artifact, has flash. At the beginning of your upkeep, put an oil counter on Mind Splice Apparatus, and instant and sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast for each oil counter on Mind Splice Apparatus. So typically the apparatus is going to make our spells cost a few mana less depending on how many oil counters are on it, but that really comes into play with Reiterate because you can actually reduce the cost of buyback because it's just an additional cost you cast to play the spell. So if we can get Mind Splice Apparatus up to say 4 oil counters, that means we can cast Reiterate with buyback for only 2 red mana. And so if we're doing that on something like, say, Pyretic Ritual, which is making 3 red mana, we've now generated an infinite amount of mana. There's not much we can do with that mana, but I'm sure we can find something to do with infinite amounts of mana. And of course, we can use Reiterate to copy something like Eternal Dominion a ton of times, provided we have the mana to keep going off. So, not necessarily the best win condition is, using Reiterate all the time, but it's going to give us a lot of copies of Eternal Dominion, which can then eventually win us the game. And it's nice to point out that instants and sorceries costing 1 less does affect buyback because that's not something that seems super intuitive, but it is very relevant for what we're trying to do with this deck. And then that's going to lead us into our next cool interaction, which is between Unexpected Windfall and Galvanic Iteration. Now, admittedly, both of these cards could be replaced by any number of cards in the deck. The important part is that Unexpected Windfall makes treasures and Galvanic Iteration copies. So Unexpected Windfall is 2 red for an instant. As an additional cost to cast this spell, discard a card, then draw 2 cards and create 2 treasure tokens. Galvanic Iteration, on the other hand, is a blue and a red for an instant. When you cast your next instant or sorcery spell this turn, copy that spell, you may choose new targets for the copy, and it has flashback for 1 blue-red. So the reason I wanted to talk about these 2 cards in particular is because if we copy Unexpected Windfall, we don't have to discard more cards. So we discard the first card to cast it, but then once we copy it, we're still drawing the cards and making the treasures, but we're not discarding any more cards. So Unexpected Windfall, especially if we can get the mana value down to just 2 by, reducing the cost of our spells, we can then cast it for 2, discard a card, draw 2 cards, make 2 treasure tokens, copy it, draw 2 more cards, make 2 more treasure tokens, and we can very easily use this to keep cycling through our deck by using the treasures to keep casting more copy effects, by using the copy effects to make more treasures, draw more cards, and hopefully eventually we get to a point where we're able to cast Eternal Dominion with all of our treasures, and we still have some treasures left over for some copy effects, so we can use Eternal Dominion, and maybe even if we have something like, say, 1,000 Year Storm, we've now cast 15, 16 spells in a turn, we can now copy the Eternal Dominion 15, 16 times, and if that doesn't win us the game, then honestly, I don't know what more we could do. So that is our cool interaction in terms of the draw effects and the treasure effects and our copy effects. So with all of that being said, let's move on to the actual price of this deck, and it wound up being $91.01, so just about $9 shy of our total budget limit. And most of that price actually came from Urabrask, which is 2 red for a Phyrexian Praetor, 4/4 first strike. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, deals 1 damage to target opponent, and you add a red. Then you can pay a red, exile it, return it to the battlefield transformed under its owner's control. It becomes the Great Work, which is a saga. And at level 1, it deals 3 damage to target opponent and each creature they control. Level 2, make 3 treasures. Level 3, until the end of turn, you may cast an instant or sorcery from your graveyard. If a spell cast this way would be put into a graveyard, exile it instead. Then you flip it back to Urabrask. So there is a lot of text on this card. It does a lot of things. And I guess technically this could also count as a win condition because it is doing 1 damage to an opponent. But I figured doing 1 damage to target opponent whenever we cast an instant or sorcery didn't count necessarily as a win condition because it's not really going to close out the game. But overall, this card does do everything we want it to do. It makes treasures, it does damage, it lets us rebuy our spells from the graveyard, and it makes mana, so it is worth that $10.31 price tag. But if you wanted to trim the cost of the price of the deck down to about $80, you could cut Urabrask and put in something else, especially if you personally want to change the win condition so it's not just Eternal Dominion. You could just throw in something like Gutter Snipe and all of a sudden you have like another win condition. So not necessary for the deck to function, but it is very powerful and worth it if you have the money to include it. But like I said, if you don't, swap it out for something else. It's not super impressive in the deck overall. On the other hand, if you're looking for a card to throw into the deck that actually does increase the budget a little bit outside of what we would normally be able to do, I have a suggestion for you there as well, plus a card that I would replace. So the card that I would put in if I had a bit more in the budget is Primal Amulet. And Primal Amulet is 4 mana for an artifact that says instant and sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. And whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, put a charge counter on Primal Amulet. Then if there are 4 or more charge counters on it, you may remove those counters and transform it. And when it transforms, it becomes Primal Wellspring, which is a land that taps for a mana of any color. But when that mana is spent to cast an instant or sorcery, you copy that spell and may choose new targets for the copy. So Primal Amulet, and by extension Primal Wellspring, does everything we want to do in this deck. It makes our stuff cheaper and then eventually copies things. So that is worth the $9 price tag, but it is unfortunately just out of our budget range. But if you are looking to put the card into the deck, I would recommend taking out Inner Fire, simply because I don't think it does quite enough for what we want it to be doing. It's 4 mana for a sorcery. You add a red to your mana pool for each card in your hand. If we're being perfectly honest, this is great when you're getting to the point where you're copying a bunch of stuff and you're able to, draw a ton of cards and you're able to reduce the cost of your spells. But in terms of it being a ritual effect, so adding mana to our mana pool, we have other cheaper options that are most of the time going to actually give us more mana when we can copy it. So Inner Fire, while very good once you start going off, it's not where you want to be to get you to the point of going off with the deck. So in that case, I don't think it's the best card in the deck. You could, of course, keep it in if you're interested in it, or if you think I'm wrong and should keep it in no matter what. Please let me know in the comments. I would love to hear the arguments for it. Not actual arguments, but you know what I mean. So let me know what you think about that one. Otherwise, though, we got to get into the final piece of this deck tech, because we have talked about this deck up and down over and over. We've talked about the cards and the win condition and what we want to do, but we've got to see how it performs in a game. So this week, we are joined by 3 separate opponents. We are joined by Shawn, playing Ashcoat of the Shadow Swarm, Bilal playing Sithis Harvest's Hand, and AngryCow playing Jaxus the Troublemaker. So right off the bat, I'm a little concerned about all of these decks. I think they're all very powerful and can definitely do some damage. So we'll see how that goes. But starting with Shawn and his Ashcoat deck, this is a rat colony deck, so he wants to play as many rat colonies as possible, which pump each other up by +1/+0. Then he wants to play Ashcoat to give them all +1/+1 for each other rat, and just kind of steamroll his opponents and make sure that nobody can really stop what he's doing. Next up, we have Bilal playing Sithis Harvest's Hand, and this is probably the deck that I'm the most concerned about going into this, because Sithis is just incredibly powerful. Just a 2 mana draw spell for any enchantment you cast is very, very strong. And I know that there are a ton of enchantments that are very, very powerful and can really get out of hand very quickly. And we really don't have a ton of stuff to deal with enchantments. Red and blue don't really deal with enchantments super well. So I think this is probably the deck that I am the most concerned about going into it, but we'll see how things play out in the end. And then finally, we have AngryCow playing Jaxus the Troublemaker. And this is the first time I've ever actually played against a Jaxus deck, but it seems very strong, very aggressive, very good at putting creatures into play and then sacrificing them to draw cards to replace them, and copying creatures that you want copies of for like enter the battlefield effects. So I am very interested to see how this deck runs. I think Cow is a great deck builder, so I think that it's going to be super sweet to see go off. But those are our opponents for the week. Please let me know in the comments which of the opponents you think is going to be the toughest for our deck to take on, or maybe just let me know which one you think is the coolest. So with all of that being said, let's jump into the game, and I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, Shawn goes first, followed by Bilal, myself, and then Cow. On Shawn's first turn, he plays a swamp. Bilal plays a Temple of Plenty, scrying 1. I play an island. Cow plays a mountain. Shawn plays a swamp and casts Rat Colony, which gets +1/+0 for each other rat he controls. Bilal plays a Reliquary Tower, gaining no maximum hand size, then casts Authority of the Consuls, gaining Bilal a life whenever a creature enters under an opponent's control, and also makes those creatures enter the battlefield tapped. I play a Temple of Epiphany, scrying 1. Cow plays a mountain and casts Generator Servant, which can sacrifice itself to make 2 mana and give a creature cast with the mana haste until the end of turn, gaining Bilal a life. Shawn plays a swamp and casts another rat colony, gaining Bilal a life, then attacks Bilal for 3. Bilal unfortunately misses his 3rd land drop, so he simply has to pass. On my turn I play a mountain and cast Haughty Djinn, which makes all of my instants and sorceries cost 1 less to cast, and also gets +X+0, where X is the number of instants and sorceries in my graveyard, which is currently 0, also gaining Bilal a life. Cow plays a mountain and casts Cursed Mirror, choosing to not have it enter as a copy of a creature. Shawn plays a swamp and casts his commander Ashcoat of the Shadow Swarm, which gains Bilal a life, gives Shawn's rats +X+X, where X is the number of rats he controls whenever Ashcoat attacks, mills him for 4 in his end step, and lets him return 2 rats in his graveyard to his hand. He then moves to combat and attacks Bilal with both of his rat colonies for 8 total damage. Then, in his end step, Shawn mills 4 and returns a rat colony from his graveyard to his hand. Bilal still misses his 3rd land, but casts Darksteel Mutation, enchanting Ashcoat, turning it into an indestructible 0/1 insect. I play an island and cast Wizards of Thay, gaining Bilal a life, making my instants and sorceries cost 1 less to cast, letting me cast sorceries as though they had flash, and it also has Myriad. Cow plays a mountain and attacks Bilal for 2 with the Generator Servant, then casts his commander Jaxus the Troublemaker, which allows him to activate it and discard a card to create a token copy of another creature, except the token has Blitz, gaining Bilal another life. Shawn plays a Wasteland and casts Dark Ritual, making 3 black mana. This allows him to cast Coat of Arms, giving each creature +1/+1 for each other creature in play that shares a creature type with it, and he also casts another rat colony, gaining Bilal a life. He then moves to combat and attacks Bilal with both rat colonies for a total of 12 damage. Bilal finally finds his 3rd land, playing a Plains, and casts Fang of Shigeki. On my turn I play a mountain and attack Shawn with the Wizards of Thay, making 2 additional copies, attacking both of my other opponents thanks to Myriad, gaining Bilal 2 total life. This does 6 damage to each of my opponents thanks to Coat of Arms, except for Shawn, who blocks with the insect, and makes all my instants and sorceries cost 4 less, letting me cast Explosion for X = 5, doing 5 damage to one of the rat colonies, killing it, drawing me 5 cards. Then at the end of combat I sacrifice the Myriad tokens. Cow plays a mountain and casts Duplicant, gaining Bilal a life, exiling my Wizards of Thay, and making it a 3/3 since the Wizards were a 3/3. Shawn casts Cryptghast, which has Extort, allows his swamps to tap for 2 mana, and gains Bilal a life. Then he casts another rat colony, gaining Bilal another life, and attacks Bilal for 12 with his rat colonies, and Bilal blocks 1 with the Fang, killing both creatures, still taking 6 total damage. On Bilal's turn, he simply untaps and passes. I play an island and cast Rowan, Scholar of Sparks, making my instants and sorceries cost 1 less to cast. I then cast Seize the Spoils, discarding a card, drawing 2 cards, and making a treasure token. I also cast Chart a Course, drawing 2 cards and discarding a card, and then this lets me activate Rowan's +1 ability, doing 3 damage to each opponent since I've drawn 3 or more cards this turn. After that resolves, I cast Big Score, discarding a card to draw 2 cards and create 2 treasure tokens, then I pass the turn. Cow plays a mountain and activates Jaxus, discarding a card to create a token copy of Duplicant with Blitz, gaining Bilal a life and exiling Shawn's Cryptghast. He then attacks Rowan for 3 with the original Duplicant, killing the Planeswalker. In his second main phase, he casts a Wormcoil Engine, gaining Bilal a life. Then, at the end of turn, he sacrifices the token Duplicant, drawing a card thanks to Blitz. Shawn plays a swamp and casts Zulaport Cutthroat, gaining Bilal a life and making each opponent lose a life while Shawn gains a life whenever a creature he controls dies. He moves to combat, attacking me for 8 with both of his rat colonies, but before damage, he ninjutsus in Nashi Moonsage's Scion, gaining Bilal a life, and still hitting me for 8, but now also exiling the top card of each player's library, letting Shawn play one of the exiled cards and spend life rather than mana to cast it. This allows Shawn to spend 4 life to cast Bilal's Holy Mantle, enchanting Nashi, giving him +2/+2 and protection from creatures. Then at the end of turn, Bilal casts Worldly Tutor, searching his library for a creature, in this case Devoted Druid, putting it on top of his library. This allows him to, on his turn, cast the Devoted Druid, which can tap for a green mana and untap itself by putting a -1/-1 counter on it. In response, I cast Frantic Search, drawing 2 cards, discarding 2 cards, and untapping 3 lands, but I don't find a response, so the Druid resolves, and Bilal also casts Swift Reconfiguration, enchanting the Druid to turn it into a vehicle, allowing him to tap it and untap it without killing it, generating infinite green mana. This lets him cast Verdurant Enchantress, drawing a card when he casts an enchantment, and cast Whip Silk, using its own ability to return it to his hand and cast it an infinite number of times, drawing his entire deck. Finally, he casts a Walking Ballista for an infinite amount of mana, doing an infinite amount of damage to each opponent, winning Bilal the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. We definitely got to showcase a little bit of what Lutri was trying to do by making all of our stuff cost a lot less. Being able to cast that explosion for X=5 was super cool, considering we did it during combat with our Myriad tokens. But we didn't get to cast Eternal Dominion. We did have it in hand, so we were almost there. And I think that if we had been able to keep the Wizards of Thay for one more turn, I think we could have done it. But it wasn't quite in the cards, wasn't meant to be, so didn't quite get there. Moving around the table next to Cow playing Jaxus. What a super sweet deck. That deck is very up my alley for things that I want to be doing in Commander. It was super cool to see the copying effects happening in mono red. It was cool to see the drawing cards happening in mono red. And it really got shut down hard by Bilal's Authority of the Consuls, because Blitz gives stuff haste and then sacrifices it. And since Cow couldn't attack the turn that things came in, it really hindered what he was trying to do. And I genuinely believe that Authority of the Consuls is probably the only reason he lost that game. So not quite to be this time, but hopefully Jaxus makes a comeback in the future. Next up to Shawn playing Ashcoat. Also kind of got hindered a lot by the Authority of the Consuls, not necessarily for the tapping of his creatures because they didn't have haste, but because of the life gain. He wanted to play so many creatures, and he couldn't quite take Bilal out of the game because he kept gaining life. And it just made it a lot more complicated for him as he kept going. Plus, losing Ashcoat very early on to what is essentially a removal spell permanently for his commander made it very difficult for him to keep putting on the pressure in the way that he wanted to. And then finally, of course, Bilal's deck. Unfortunately, it really didn't do much, which is saying something considering he was the one that won the game. But he was stuck on 2 mana and then eventually 3 mana for the entire game. But he was able to find a combo, well, I say find. He tutored for a combo that was able to make him infinite mana and then draw his entire deck and then eventually win him the game. So not necessarily the best win condition, I'm not going to lie. It was a little disappointing in the moment to see the person stuck on mana just kind of sneak a win out of nowhere. But looking back on it, definitely very cool because he got beat down the entire game and he really didn't do much. So it was very impressive to see him kind of clutch a victory right at the end. So very cool showing by everybody. Hopefully we'll get to see some of these decks in the future. Let me know in the comments whose deck you think was either the coolest or did the coolest thing, or maybe that you would like to see come back for any future games. But that was our Lutri deck. Please do like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.